The evening air was calm in the small town, the kind of peace that only came when the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a golden glow. Charles Carter, a 72-year-old war veteran, walked slowly down the sidewalk, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn-out jacket. He had lived in this town for over 40 years, but tonight something felt different. As he turned the corner near the gas station, the flashing red and blue lights of a police car caught his attention. The siren wasn't blaring, but the presence of law enforcement at this hour made him uneasy. He adjusted the old military cap on his head and kept walking, minding his own business. Then, a harsh voice broke the silence. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" Charles slowed down, but didn't stop immediately. The voice carried authority, but also arrogance. He turned to see two police officers stepping out of their patrol car. The taller one, Officer Barnes, had a smug look on his face. The second officer, Riley, looked younger but equally eager. "What's the problem, officers?" Charles asked, his voice calm yet firm. Barnes approached, his hand resting on his holster. "You're walking around pretty late. What are you doing here?" Charles raised an eyebrow. "I live just down the road, just taking a walk. Didn't know that was a crime." Barnes smirked. "Loitering is a crime, old man." Charles sighed. He had seen men like this before, young, full of power, and eager to prove themselves. He had dealt with far worse in war, but this was his own country, his own town. He never thought he'd be treated like a suspect just for walking home. "I served this country," Charles said, standing a little straighter. "I fought in wars before you were even born. You're really stopping me for walking." Officer really chuckled. "Oh, we got a hero here, huh? You got an ID, old man." Charles clenched his jaw. He didn't like being called old man, like he was some nobody. He pulled out his wallet with slow, deliberate movements and handed over his veteran's ID. Barnes snatched it from his hand, glancing at it before scoffing. "Vietnam veteran, huh? Guess that don't mean much these days." He tossed the ID back at Charles, letting it fall to the ground. A flicker of anger passed through Charles's eyes, but he kept his composure. He had learned long ago that losing his temper never ended well. He bent down to pick up his ID, his knees aching from old war injuries. That's when Barnes shoved him. It wasn't a hard push, but it was enough to make Charles stumble. His back hit the cold brick wall of the nearby store, and for a split second, his body reacted like it had in the war. His muscles tensed, his instincts screamed, and his mind prepared for a fight. But he wasn't on the battlefield anymore. He was in his own town, facing men who were supposed to protect people, not harass them. "You better watch yourself," Barnes sneered. "Old men like you should know when to keep their heads down." Charles took a slow breath. His hands curled into fists, but he didn't raise them. Instead, he straightened up, staring right into Barnes's eyes. "You have no idea who you're messing with." For the first time, Barnes hesitated. There was something in Charles's voice, not fear, not anger, but certainty, like a warning. Officer really shifted uncomfortably. "Come on, Barnes. He's just an old guy. Let's go." Barnes scoffed again, but didn't push any further. "Stay out of trouble, Grandpa." With that, the two officers walked back to their patrol car. Charles watched them leave, his heartbeat steady, but his mind racing. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this time it felt different. Because this wasn't over. As the patrol car disappeared down the road, Charles pulled out his old flip phone. His hands were steady now as he dialed the number he rarely used. The phone rang once, twice, then a voice answered. "Dad?" A slow, relieved sigh left Charles's lips. "Son, I need you to come home." There was a long pause, and then, in a voice colder than steel, his son replied, "What happened?" Charles looked down at his hands, at the faded scars and the tattoo of his old unit insignia. Some cops forgot who they were talking to. Another pause. Then the reply came. "I'm on my way." The call ended. Charles exhaled, slipping the phone back into his pocket. The air was still calm, but something in the world had shifted. Because Jake Carter, the deadliest Delta Force commander in history, was coming home. And those cops had no idea what was about to happen. The night air was still, but in Charles Carter's heart, a storm was brewing. He stood on his front porch, staring down the quiet road. His old bones ached, but his mind was sharp, sharper than it had been in years. He had made the call. And now, his son was coming home. Charles didn't call his son unless it was serious. Jake Carter wasn't just any soldier. He was a legend, the kind of warrior whose name was whispered among those who knew what real danger looked like. A Delta Force commander with more classified missions under his belt than most generals. The kind of man who could disappear into the shadows and leave destruction in his wake. And right now, he was on his way. Miles away, in a darkened military airfield. A black SUV rolled up to a private hangar. The driver barely had time to stop before the door opened, and Jake Carter stepped out. He moved with the precision of a man who had spent his entire life in combat zones. His dark tactical clothing hugged his powerful frame, and his piercing eyes scanned the surroundings like he was always expecting an ambush. Two men stood waiting for him. They were high-ranking military officials, but as soon as they saw Jake, their postures stiffened. They knew who he was. They knew what he was capable of. "Commander Carter, is there a situation?" one of them asked cautiously. Jake didn't answer. He just walked straight past them toward the waiting helicopter. "Sir, we need to know." Jake stopped. He turned his head just enough to look at them. "I'm going home." The way he said it sent a shiver down their spines. They didn't ask any more questions. Within minutes, the helicopter rode to life, lifting off into the night sky. Jake leaned back in his seat, his jaw tight. His father hadn't given details, but he didn't have to. Someone had messed with the wrong man. Back in town, Officer Barnes was still smirking as he sat in the diner, sipping his coffee. He and Riley had finished their shift and were now enjoying the small-town silence. "Did you see his face?" Barnes chuckled. Old man looked like he was about to cry. Riley shifted in his seat. "I don't know, man. Something about him felt off." Barnes scoffed. "Please, just another washed-up vet who thinks wearing a uniform makes him special." Riley hesitated. "Yeah, but what if he is special?" Before Barnes could reply, a shadow passed the window. A figure moved through the darkness, too fast to get a clear look. Then, the diner door swung open, and a man stepped inside. Tall, silent. His presence commanded the room without saying a word. His cold, calculating gaze locked onto the two officers. The diner went dead silent. Officer Riley froze. His instincts screamed danger. Barnes, still arrogant, scoffed. "What are you looking at, buddy?" The man took a step closer. The air felt heavier. Then, in a voice so quiet it sent chills down their spines, he spoke. "You put your hands on my father." Riley's blood ran cold. Barnes smirked, but his voice wasn't as confident anymore. "Who the hell are you?" The man's gaze didn't waver. "My name is Jake Carter." Riley's heart stopped. Barnes laughed nervously. He had heard that name before. Somewhere. But before he could reach. Jake took another step forward. And suddenly, everything changed. The silence in the diner felt heavy, pressing down on every soul inside. Even the waitress, who had been wiping the counter, froze mid-motion, her eyes darting between the officers and the man standing before them. Jake Carter. Riley's breath hitched in his throat. He had heard that name before. Somewhere in military circles, whispered in the kind of conversations where men spoke carefully. Stories about missions that didn't exist, about a soldier who never failed. Barnes, still cocky, leaned back in his chair. Jake Carter, huh? And I should know you because… Jake didn't respond. He simply tilted his head, his piercing gaze locked onto Barnes. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement. You don't know who you've messed with. Riley's fingers twitched. His gut told him to get up and leave, but his legs refused to move. Jake took a slow step forward. His movements were controlled, precise. The kind of movement Barnes and Riley had only seen in movies. Barnes scoffed again, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Look, pal, I don't know what your deal is, but… Thude. Jake's hands slammed onto the table, rattling the coffee cups. His face remained calm, his voice deadly quiet. What did you do to my father? The question wasn't loud. It wasn't a shout, but it carried weight, enough weight to make Barnes instinctively swallow hard. Riley's pulse spiked. His partner had no idea what kind of man he was dealing with. Barnes rolled his eyes. We did our job. Your old man was being difficult, so we made sure he knew who's in charge. Jake blinked slowly. His fingers curled into a fist, but just for a second. Then he exhaled, unclenching his hand. He wasn't going to lose control. Not yet. You made a mistake, he said quietly. Barnes smirked, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Oh yeah. And what are you going to do about it? Jake leaned in just enough to whisper, You're going to fix it. Riley felt the air shift. The threat wasn't in Jake's words. It was in his presence. A dangerous man doesn't need to yell. A dangerous man simply exists, and people feel the weight of it. Barnes chuckled, trying to brush off the tension. And if we don't? Jake straightened, his eyes like steel. Then I'll make sure you never forget my name. The way he said it, it wasn't a promise. It was a certainty. For the first time that night, Barnes looked away. The waitress, sensing the storm in the air, quickly shuffled over. Gentlemen, please, let's not cause trouble. Jake held Barnes's gaze for another long second. Then, he slowly turned toward the door. As he reached for the handle, he stopped. Without looking back, he spoke one last time. Go back to my father. Make this right. Tonight. And with that, he walked out. Back at Charles Carter's home, Charles sat on his porch, staring at the night sky. His hands rested on the arms of his old chair, but his mind wasn't at peace. Then, from the distance, he heard the sound of an engine approaching. Headlights cut through the darkness. And when the car stopped in front of his house, two familiar officers stepped out. Charles narrowed his eyes. Barnes and Riley looked different. No arrogance, no smirks, just quiet unease. Barnes cleared his throat. Mr. Carter, we just wanted to. Before he could finish, Charles smiled. He knew exactly why they were here. The air was thick with tension. Charles Carter sat on his worn-out porch chair, his gaze steady as he watched the two officers step out of their car. Their usual arrogance was gone. Barnes cleared his throat. Mr. Carter, we just wanted to. But Charles raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. He already knew. He could see it in their eyes. They weren't here out of respect. They were here because of his son. A slow smile crept onto Charles's face. Let me guess, you ran into Jake. Riley shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Barnes forced a smirk, trying to keep up his tough act. Yeah, we met your boy. Thought he'd be taller. Charles chuckled. Did he say much? Riley finally spoke, his voice quieter than usual. He didn't have to. That made Charles nod. That's my boy. He leaned back in his chair, taking his time before responding. He could feel the officers' nervous energy, their restless shifting, the way their hands hovered too close to their belts. They were scared. Good. So, what do you boys want? Charles finally asked, acting as if nothing had happened. You here to apologize. Barnes exhaled sharply, clearly uncomfortable with the idea. Look, old man, No, Charles interrupted, his tone suddenly sharp. You look. You've humiliated me in front of the whole damn town. Threw me to the ground like some criminal. You think a half-hearted apology will fix that? Barnes clenched his jaw, but Riley nudged him. It was the first time Barnes looked unsure of himself. Riley took a step forward. We understand. That's why we came back. It won't happen again. Charles studied him for a long moment. Then he laughed, a low, knowing chuckle. Not because you've suddenly grown a conscience, but because my son scared the hell out of you. Barnes tensed, but didn't deny it. That was all the confirmation Charles needed. Jake had left an impact. Charles stood up slowly. He wasn't a tall man, not anymore, but he didn't need to be. Right now, with the way Barnes and Riley couldn't meet his eyes, he knew he had won. He stepped toward them, stopping just inches away. I served this country with honor. You disrespected me, but you know what? I'm not mad anymore. Barnes blinked. You're not? Charles smirked. No, because now, you know better. And if you don't, he leaned in just slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. Jake will remind you. Neither officer responded. They didn't have to. They knew the truth. And as they turned and walked back to their car, Charles watched them go, rocking back on his heels. When the taillights disappeared down the road, he finally sat back down, picking up his cup of coffee. With a small, satisfied grin, he muttered under his breath. That's my boy. The sun had started to set, casting long shadows across Charles Carter's front porch. He sat in his usual chair, rocking slowly, the wooden floor creaking beneath him. The town felt different now. Quieter, more respectful. Word had spread fast. The two officers, Barnes and Riley, had changed overnight. They no longer harassed the old man. No more mocking grins. No more rough hands shoving him to the ground. Instead, they kept their distance, walking on eggshells whenever they crossed his path. Even the sheriff had paid Charles a visit, though his words were carefully chosen. I hope there are no hard feelings, Mr. Carter. We're all just trying to do our jobs. Charles had simply smiled. As long as you remember who I am. And they did. Because Jake made sure of it. The final warning. Charles had never asked his son what exactly happened when he met the officers. He didn't have to. He saw it in their eyes, the way their hands trembled slightly when they spoke, the way they flinched at loud sounds. Whatever Jake did, it left a mark. One evening, a sleek black SUV pulled up in front of Charles's house. The engine purred, a quiet beast waiting in the dark. The back door opened, and out stepped Jake Carter. The war had aged him, but his sharp eyes still held that dangerous glint. He climbed the porch steps and sat beside his father. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Charles smirked. You didn't have to do all that, son. Jake exhaled a short chuckle. You're my father. They needed to learn. Charles shook his head, but he wasn't mad. He was proud. What did you say to them? Jake's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened. I didn't say much. Just told them about a few missions. Showed them some things they'd never seen before. He smirked. They got the message. Charles chuckled. Scared them half to death, huh? Jake leaned back, watching the sky turn deep orange. Let's just say, if they ever touch you again, they won't have to worry about their jobs anymore. He glanced at his father. They'll have to worry about disappearing. Silence stretched between them. Then Charles let out a satisfied sigh. Good boy. Jake grinned. Taught by the best. The town may not have understood what had changed, but Charles did. The message had been delivered, loud and clear. No one would ever lay a hand on him again. And if they did, they wouldn't live long enough to regret it.